What does the American dream mean today? A question that is often asked by many people during modern times. However, during hard times and in professional wrestling, the American dream is always going to mean the patriarch of one of wrestling's finest families. A family that's the topic of this episode. Because today... This episode comes to you as the result of the polls over on Patreon. Brand new polls are up right now, so go ahead, sign up, and vote. And while I'm at it, I also want to give a big thank you to my Patreon supporters, such as Jeff Ang, Andy Savardi, and Zane BR. Thank you so much for the support. The American Dream, the son of a plumber, Dusty Rhodes, was born Virgil Riley Reynolds Jr. He was born in Austin, Texas, and graduated from Arlington Heights High School in Fort Worth. Rhodes was an avid baseball fan, playing for West Texas State University, which is now known as West Texas A&M. He also played football there as well. This led to him trying out for the NFL's Boston Patriots, who are now known as the New England Patriots, but he was cut. He then went to play for the Continental Football League and their team, the Hartford Charter Oaks, until they closed. But it was from there that things would change forever. Once there, he got his real-life friends Bobby Duncombe and the Funks to endorse him to a promoter, despite having no wrestling experience prior. But things worked out in the end, as he would go on to get training, particularly from that of Joe Blanchard. That's right, Tully's father. And speaking of names you know, how exactly did he get the name of Dusty Rhodes? Well, there are two conflicting stories about that. Some claim that his love of baseball was the culprit, as he was supposedly inspired by baseball player Jim Rhodes, whose nickname was Dusty. However, there is also another claim out there that he was first billed as Dusty Reynolds. That is, until he went back to Texas and World-Class Championship Wrestling, because it was allegedly there that Gary Hart suggested that he change his name to Lonesome Rhodes, a reference to the Andy Griffith character in the movie A Face in the Crowd. To which the American Dream replied, "Well, I don't plan on being lonesome, I think I'll stick with Dusty." Either way, no matter. Gary Hart was so impressed by Dusty that he went on to become his manager, pairing Rhodes up with Don Jardine, with the two forming a heel tag team. From there, Rhodes would go on to be part of other promotions and also become a part of the Texas Outlaws tag team with Dick Murdoch. He would also continue to work with Gary Hart and another tag partner, Pak Song, and it was thanks to the two of them that we would all get the Dusty that we know and love. Song and Hart turned on Dusty during a tag match in Florida, and as a result, Dusty turned a babyface, and finally, his natural charisma and star power were allowed to shine. This is where he began calling himself the American Dream, representing the everyman, because he believed that with hard work and dedication, he could triumph over adversity and achieve success. Which is a story that actually mirrored Dusty's real life. Just think about it. He was cut from the NFL, went to another organization which had to shut down, and then during his early years of professional wrestling, he had to sleep in his car. But despite not having a typical professional wrestler appearance, his dedication and his skills as a performer allowed him to become one of the greatest megastars in professional wrestling history. Now, outside the ring, Dusty had several children, including Cody, who we will be getting to later on, Kristen, who was a Dallas Cowboy cheerleader, as well as our next entry into the Rhodes family, Dustin Patrick Reynolds. The grandson of a plumber would begin working under the name Dustin Rhodes in 1988 for Championship Wrestling from Florida, a promotion where his dad would also work for too. From there, Dustin would hop around a lot during his early years, working for All Japan, the USWA, the CWA, and even both WCW and the WWF briefly before making more notable runs with each company. Dustin's first appearance on WWF TV was on an episode of Saturday Night's Main Event, where he was part of the catalyst for the feud between Dusty and Ted DiBiase. Then in 1991, Dustin would return to World Championship Wrestling, and he would wrestle as the natural Dustin Rhodes. His first major feud was with Larry Zbyszko before moving on to another rivalry with the York Foundation, a heel stable of business types led by Alexandra York, played by Dustin's eventual wife, Terry Boatwright. Afterwards, Dustin would win the WCW United States Championship by defeating Ricky Steamboat in the finals of a tournament for the vacant title. However, the natural second run in WCW would eventually come to an end when he was fired for blading in the awful King of the Road match with the Blacktop Bully, as that was against company policy at the time. But all was not lost, as from here he would re-debut in the WWF with the name and character that he's probably most known for, the character of Goldust. Now, the story behind his character, according to some sources, goes a little something like this. Dustin, after leaving WCW, was on the phone with Vince McMahon, who offered him the part playing an androgynous character. Dustin agreed, not knowing what the word androgynous meant, and when he decided to look it up afterwards, he was shocked to find out its true meaning. However, he decided to make the most of it, and since he was looking to step out of his father's shadow and make his own legacy, he did exactly that, working with Vince McMahon to craft the character that we would come to know today. And it definitely worked, with many fans originally not knowing who was under the gold paint, and in many ways, the gimmick was ahead of its time, and some would even say it still might be even now, with the persona taking the concept of ring psychology to a whole new level. Now, going back to Dustin's former wife, Terry Boatwright, aka Terry Reynolds, she began as a makeup artist for CNN. However, on weekends, she would moonlight by doing makeup for Jim Crockett Promotions. Then, once the company was bought by Ted Turner, it was Ole Anderson that asked if she would be interested in becoming a manager, a role that she would continue with upon joining the WWF later on with Dustin. Oh, and speaking of Rhodes through marriage, someone that many people may not know was related to the family is Dusty's brother-in-law, Fred Ottman, also known as Tugboat, Typhoon, and yes, the Shockmaster. Additionally, Dusty was also married to the sister-in-law of Nasty Boy, Jerry Saggs. Oh, and kayfabe-wise, the character of Oksana married Goldust just to stay in the United States, but that was just a story. And of course, let's not forget about another Rhodes through marriage, Brandi Alexis Reed, also known as Brandi Rhodes. Brandi was a competitive ice skater for 17 years before shifting her focus to academia. She received a full scholarship to the University of Michigan, worked as a reporter, then moved to Florida to begin a modeling and acting career. And while she was doing that, she would also earn her master's in broadcast journalism. In 2011, Brandi got involved with pro wrestling, signing a developmental contract with WWE. Yep, I'm willing to bet that some of you forgot about this. She mostly worked in their developmental territory FCW, but she did also get to ring announce for NXT and SmackDown under the name Eden Styles. Now, during this time, she would only get to participate in one match, which was a battle royal for FCW. Following that, she would ask for her release from the company, which was granted. But not long after, she would return to WWE in 2013, and would continue her announcing duties, even getting to work WrestleMania 31. But alas, in 2016, her and her now husband would leave WWE. Now, who is that husband? Well, I think you already know. He's the American Nightmare, Cody Rhodes. Interestingly enough, the American Nightmare moniker was actually first used by Dustin in WCW. Born Cody Garrett Reynolds, Cody would have a successful amateur wrestling career in high school, winning the Georgia State Tournament in both his junior and senior years. But instead of going the amateur route, he would decide to pursue a professional wrestling career instead. Now, before that, starting at age 12, Dusty would actually show Cody the ropes in a very baseline way. However, moving forward to being an adult, Cody would join Ohio Valley Wrestling, where he would credit trainers such as Al Snow, Danny Davis, and Randy Orton as being the ones who would help develop him even further. It was around this time that Cody would form a tag team with Shawn Spears, which eventually led to their storyline rivalry in AEW. But of course, for many mainstream audiences, most WWE fans would remember him for teaming with the likes of Hardcore Holly, Damien Sandow, the faction of Legacy consisting of Ted DiBiase Jr. and the aforementioned Randy Orton, as well as getting to partner up with his big brother Dustin, most notably in the team of Goldust and Stardust. But on top of that, let's not forget that Cody has also had an amazing singles career too, including his runs as the dashing Cody Rhodes as well as the undashing Cody Rhodes, and also winning the WWE Intercontinental Championship and bringing back the good design for that belt. To which I have to say, thanks for that, Cody. However, briefly going back to that Stardust gimmick, this would lead to the end of Cody's time in WWE as he pleaded to ditch the character, providing several suggestions to creative, but to no avail. Cody would request his release, and it would be granted. But this would work out for the best. All this would eventually lead to the show All In, and Cody winning the belt of his father, the 10 pounds of gold, the NWA World Heavyweight Championship. Family is pretty important, and there have been many important wrestling families to go around. But out of all the kin to take to the squared circle, there is one family that stands out in the minds of many. From their famous training dungeon to their contributions to the world of professional wrestling throughout multiple generations, they have easily earned their place as a wrestling dynasty. And they've also earned their place as the topic of this episode, because today, Dave knows the Hart family. Now, my fandom for this famous wrestling clan could not be stated enough, especially with my appreciation for the training and the wrestlers that came out of the famous Hart family dungeon. And with that being said, we might as well start things off with the patriarch and the man behind the dungeon. And since the Hart family tree is not known for being a small one, we might as well get started as soon as we possibly can. Stu Hart is the man that served as the head of the household for the Hart family. He was born in 1915 and began his life living off the land and growing up in a tent on the prairie lands of Alberta. As a young man, Stu was a great all-round athlete, trying just about any sport he could. But his true athletic love was submission wrestling, and he began his training in that field with catch wrestling. Now, some of that training included being put into some really grueling submission holds, even going so far as being put into those holds until his head turned blue. But it was this first-hand experience of what submissions could really do that taught Stu quite a lot. And it was this exact method that he would adopt when he started his own teachings in the Hart family dungeon. However, after suffering a severe accident with a truck, Stu would end up hospitalized. And by the time he got out, it was just in time for World War II. So Stu enlisted and he became part of the Royal Canadian Navy. And from there, he became their director of athletics. Now, as such, Stu was still looking forward to being used in more of a militaristic capacity, but the Navy preferred having him in their athletics department. This led to him wrestling on a regular basis for the entertainment of the other servicemen, performing before thousands. And this is where Stu Hart, the wrestling performer, was born. Stu then went on to make his professional wrestling debut in New York City in 1946. From there, Stu would wrestle in several territories before founding Stampede Wrestling, which he did with the help of several men he knew during his time in the Navy. Stampede became very successful in Canada and was the home-based promotion for much of the Hart family. But that brings me to... Stu and his wife Helen had 12 children, 8 boys and 4 girls. All 8 boys became wrestlers and all the girls married wrestlers. Now, the oldest of the Hart children is Smith Hart. Smith made his wrestling debut in 1973 and officially retired in 1991. And while he mostly wrestled for Stampede, he also wrestled for the World Wrestling Council, the International Wrestling Enterprise, and the National Wrestling Alliance, as well as making brief appearances in the WWE. And throughout his time in the ring, he was a WWC Caribbean Tag Team Champion with his brother Bret and was inducted into the Canadian Wrestling Hall of Fame in 2001. The second oldest Hart child is Bruce Hart. Bruce headlined for Stampede, sometimes even wrestling while injured. He then moved on to wrestling in England as Bronco Bruce in joint promotions, where he met the wrestler, the Dynamite Kid, and then by extension, the British Bulldog. Bruce then went on to book and wrestle in New Japan. Following the sale of Stampede Wrestling to the WWF, Bruce would then make several appearances for that company as well. Then, in the late 90s, Bruce brought Stampede Wrestling back with other members of his famous family. But this time, the roster would focus on the third generation of Harts, but more on them later. And ever since hanging up his boots, Bruce has since turned his skills into teaching and training. Next up is Keith Hart, who had a reputation as a very gifted amateur wrestler, and of course, he also wrestled for Stampede. And he also got to team with his brothers Bruce, Bret, and Owen at the 1993 Survivor Series. Following him is Wayne Hart, who only wrestled very briefly, but instead was more known for his work as a referee. Then next we have Dean Hart. Now, Dean was the first of his brothers to win an amateur wrestling championship. He would also then go on to wrestle professionally for Stampede. Now, this led to him traveling with his brothers Bret and Bruce to Dory Funk's promotion in Amarillo, Texas, after becoming close friends with Dory. Now, Dean also worked as a referee, as well as behind the scenes, and he also managed to find success outside of the world of professional wrestling as a music promoter. Then comes the oldest girl of the Hart clan, Elizabeth, otherwise known as Ellie, who married Jim the Anvil Neihart. The Anvil, of course, was known as one half of the tag team, the Hart Foundation, with Bret, and also as a member of the stable of the very same name. Now, Jim was not Canadian, but after being released by the Dallas Cowboys, he made his way up north to Canada and began his work as a professional wrestler in Stampede. From there, he made his way to teaming up with his brother-in-law Bret, joining the WWF, and even tagging with Owen Hart as the new foundation. Neihart also wrestled for ECW, New Japan, and WCW, and he also appeared in TNA. Now, the Anvil and Ellie got divorced in 2001, but they would get remarried again in 2010, and together they had 3 daughters, one of which is, of course, Natalie Neihart, otherwise known as Natty Neihart, also known as Natalia. And Natty went on to marry another professional wrestler, T.J. Wilson, also known as Tyson Kidd, who was a close friend of the family and had been ever since he was 10 years old. Next up is Stu and Helen's daughter, Georgia, who married wrestler B.J. Annis, who also worked as a professional bodybuilder and wrestled for Stampede. Together they had 2 daughters and 2 sons, one of which is Edward Annis, better known as Teddy Hart, who by the way is one of my personal favorites, and you've also seen him on this channel. And now here comes the most well-known member of the Hart family, Bret the Hitman Hart. Now, I could go on and on about Bret, so I will try to keep this brief. Bret began excelling in amateur wrestling at a very early age. It was believed by many that he could have been an Olympic-level wrestler. However, Bret would go on to study filmmaking in college instead, as he was seeking a career with more long-term options than anything the Olympics could possibly offer. He knew that even at its best-case scenario, he could only be an Olympic wrestler for a few years before moving on to coaching. Bret was looking for something that he could remain viable in for more than just a brief run. However, he also knew that his father wanted to see him involved in athletics, and so professional wrestling became his best option. From there, Bret, of course, excelled in wrestling for Stampede before going on to the WWF, and it was at that point that Bret Hart would become the star that we all know today. He won a whole host of championships in both the WWF and WCW. He main evented multiple WrestleManias and was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame in 2006. The next child in line is daughter Allison, who married wrestler Ben Basarab. Following her came Ross Hart. Like his brothers, Ross spent a lot of time in Stampede Wrestling as well as making a few appearances in the WWF. In addition, Ross has also spent a fair amount of time as a booker, promoter, and as a trainer. And it has also been said that Ross is the wrestling historian of the Hart family and has an encyclopedic knowledge of the business. And the next Hart in the family line is Diana Hart. Now, she was married to the British Bulldog Davey Boy Smith, thus putting the Bulldog into the family, as well as by extension his cousin Tom Billington, the Dynamite Kid. Diana was also involved herself in a storyline between Bret and the Bulldog going into her SummerSlam match in Wembley Stadium. Also, Diana and the Bulldog's son, Harry Smith, is a professional wrestler himself, who has gone by many names, but is mostly known now as Davey Boy Smith Jr. And finally we have Owen Hart. The youngest of the Hart family, Owen was known as a gifted technical wrestler. He also wrestled in the independent circuit for a brief period of time before being called up for a brief run in the WWF. Now, this run was as the Blue Blazer, the unfortunate gimmick that would eventually lead to his tragic end. However, after that quick run, he then returned to the independent wrestling scene and even spent a brief amount of time in WCW before returning back to the WWF. But this time, he would do so under his real name. During this run, he would win the King of the Ring, the European Championship, the tag team titles, twice with Yokozuna, and once with the British Bulldog, as well as once with Jeff Jarrett. He also won the Intercontinental title twice, and not to mention, 3 Slammy Awards. And finally, a few others associated with the Hart family, such as their cousin, Roddy Piper, as well as family friends, such as Brian Pillman and Chris Benoit. Family and Lucha Libre, 2 things that make up the very fabric of professional wrestling. And when you put the 2 of them together, well, there's one name that seems to rise above most. And it's a family name that just so happens to be the topic of this episode. Because today... Thank you to Cool Ass Jack and Inigo Montoya and all of my other Patreon supporters for all the help during these times. Now, if you want to get your own Patreon shout out, then please sign up over on my Patreon page. And if you just want to support the channel, well, give this video a big like and please make sure that you're subscribed. Anyway, with that being said, let's get into the video. The Guerrero family is easily one of the most important wrestling families in all of wrestling history, as their influence has ranged all the way from Mexico to the United States to even Japan. And so, in order to cover this family properly, well, why don't we just start at the beginning? Born Salvador Guerrero Quesada in 1921, Arizona, the person who would one day be known as Gory Guerrero would move to Mexico at the age of 9, where his father would work as an interpreter in Guadalajara. From there, Gory would join a gym looking to learn boxing, but instead would be taught the art of lucha libre, wrestling his first match in September of 1937. After this, he would begin wrestling under the name Joe Morgan, until changing it to Gory Guerrero, in reference to his reputation for having bloody matches. Then, 6 years later, after his debut, he would begin to work for EMLL, where he would be named Rookie of the Year, and would go on to win the Mexican National Welterweight Championship, and later the Mexican National Middleweight Championship. Furthermore, as a pioneer of Lucha Libre himself, Gory would get to tag with the legendary El Santo, as well as making appearances in some of his films. And that wasn't the only legend that Gory would get to tangle with, as he also got a chance to compete for the NWA World Championship against Lou Thesz, although he would not win. Oh, and he would also have a feud with Enrique Yanez, a name that we will be getting more into in just a little bit. Anyway, Gory would leave the EMLL in 1966 and then start working with Dory Funk Sr. He would also begin running shows and booking for both NWA Hollywood and World Class Championship Wrestling. He is also credited as the inventor of La de a Caballo, or the one on horseback, better known today as the Camel Clutch, as well as the Gory Special and all of its variations such as the Gory Bomb, the Gory Driver, and the Gory Cradle, just to name a few. Oh, and allow me to apologize for my poor pronunciation on any of the Spanish you might hear in this video. Gory would retire in the 1980s, but he would keep busy by selling auto insurance as well as opening up his home to train future wrestlers. Now, going back to Enrique Yanez, while the two men feuded in the ring, they would become family outside of it, as Gory married Enrique's sister Herlinda, and together they would have 6 children, the oldest of which is none other than Salvador Guerrero III, or Chavo Guerrero, or Chavo Sr., or Chavo Classic. Chavo would begin wrestling in the NWA Western States before the family moved from Texas to California for NWA Hollywood, where he would feud with Roddy Piper for the America's Heavyweight Championship, a title that he would ultimately win 15 times. In addition to this, he would also get to feud with Atsushi Onita, as Chavo would find himself wrestling all over the globe, including spending time in All Japan. But these were not the only major promotions that Chavo would get to work for, as he also feuded with Gino Hernandez in Mid-South Wrestling, as well as entering tag team feuds with both the Rock and Roll Express and the Fabulous Ones after he began teaming with his brother Hector in Championship Wrestling from Florida. But of course, first, in 1976, Chavo would team up with his father Gory, and the two of them would be the first Guerreros to officially team up. Eventually, they would win the NWA's America's Championship. Chavo also wrestled for the AWA, the CWF, and the EMLL, among many others. And in his later years, he would become a prominent figure on WWE TV, known to many as Chavo Classic. And after that, he would begin appearing for Lucha Underground. Next, the second oldest son of the Guerrero family is Armando Guerrero Yanez, better known to many as Mondo. He began wrestling around the same time as his brother Chavo, pretty much following a very similar career path. That is until 1980, where he would wrestle for New Japan Pro Wrestling. But he would also get to spend time with his brothers in the AWA, feuding with Bad Company. Additionally, he would also wrestle for the UWA, the EMLL, and even wrestled as El Psicopata in AAA. Plus, he was a trainer for the original Glow. Although, speaking of shows, he would also get to work as a stuntman in major motion pictures as a result of meeting Gene LaBelle, which he did while wrestling for Gene's brother Mike. Next, on to the third son of the family, Hector Manuel Guerrero Yanez. Like his brother Mondo, was born in Mexico City, but he spent much of his time as a youth in El Paso, Texas, where his oldest and youngest brothers were born. Hector would begin wrestling in 1973, where he would primarily be working with his two older brothers. After that, he would get to wrestle for Jim Crockett Promotions as the masked wrestler Lasertron, which somehow isn't the worst costume that Hector has ever had to wear, as he was also the gobbledygooker in the WWF, featured during the 1990 Survivor Series, as well as again during WrestleMania 17. And yes, it was Hector wearing that costume again for that match too. Hector has also wrestled for Smoky Mountain Wrestling, ECW, the AWA, Mid-South, and in Japan before eventually arriving in WCW, where he would go against his younger brother, although he would leave the company quickly afterwards as he did not feel happy about how he was being treated. Then in 2007, Hector would join TNA as the Spanish color commentator as well as the manager of LAX. Now, going back to Chavo Sr., well, obviously enough, he had a son, Chavo Jr., who was also born as Salvador Guerrero in El Paso, Texas. But one advantage that Jr. had was, as mentioned earlier, Gory's home had become a training ground with a wrestling ring in the backyard, where Chavo would make great use of this, training alongside his youngest uncle, who was only 3 years older than him. Chavo would begin to wrestle in Mexico before touring Japan and even getting to compete in the Best of the Super Juniors tournament. Then in 1996, he would wrestle for WCW, getting the opportunity to wrestle against Ric Flair during one of his early matches for the company, although his time there is probably most known for his work with his uncle, including the Latino World Order storyline and when he was driven mad by his uncle and became obsessed with a toy horse named Pepe. But after Uncle Eddie left for the WWF alongside the other Radicals, Chavo remained in WCW, where audiences would get to see what he could do on his own. And while he did win some gold during his time in World Championship Wrestling, including the tag titles with Lash LaRue and 2 runs with the Cruiserweight belt, it's what Chavo would do after WCW that would make a much bigger impression and all the difference amongst many fans. Recently, like his uncle Mondo, Chavo would work as a trainer for the show Glow, but this time it would be the Netflix version, and he would also get to appear in the show as well. And in addition, he would get a stint in Lucha Underground and AEW. But going back to the purchase of WCW by WWE, Chavo's contract was picked up immediately. At first, he spent his time on the undercard before eventually joining back up again with his uncle to form Los Guerreros. But before we get into that, let's get into some other family members first. For you see, Uncle Eddie had a daughter, Shaul Guerrero, who, under the name Raquel Diaz, would wrestle for WWE, originally starting out in Florida Championship Wrestling, the promotion that would eventually become NXT. Then, after leaving, she would get engaged to her fellow wrestler and NXT alum, Aiden English. The two would get married in 2016, and following that, Shaul would eventually get to make an appearance for AEW in 2020. Oh, but excuse me, let's not forget about Shaul's mother, Vicky Guerrero, who was also Eddie's wife. But that leads us to... Now, on to the most famous member of the Guerrero family, Eduardo "Gory" Guerrero, better known to everyone as Eddie Guerrero. Eddie was born in El Paso, Texas, and he attended the University of New Mexico and New Mexico Highlands University on an athletic scholarship, developing his skills as a collegiate wrestler before moving to Mexico to hone his practices as a professional. From there, he would work for the Empresa Mexicana de Lucha Libre, which was now rebranded as the Consejo Mundial de Lucha Libre, and he would do so under a mask with the name of Máscara Mágica. However, after leaving AAA, it's important to note that his mask gimmick would still belong to CMLL, so therefore Eddie decided to unmask publicly right then and there, making him the first luchador to ever do so. However, this break from tradition met with a volatile reaction. During this time, Eddie would wrestle for both New Japan and AAA, and he would also get to win the Best of the Super Juniors tournament in 1996. Meanwhile, in AAA, Eddie would form a tag team with El Hijo de Santo, forming a new version of La Parija Atómica, which was originally the team name for Santo and Gory. Although this tag team would be short-lived, as Eddie would turn on the son of Santo and instead aligned himself with Art Barr, who would be the inspiration for Eddie using the Frog Splash. Now, as this was happening, the two would get the notice of one Paul Heyman, which led to Eddie joining ECW in 1995. Eddie wouldn't be with the Extreme brand for very long, as he soon signed with WCW, who he already briefly wrestled for back in 1989 and in 1991. But now, after his epic rivalry with Dean Malenko in ECW over the television championship, he would return to World Championship Wrestling as a star, getting to once again compete against New Japan wrestlers, but this time he would get to do it representing WCW in the Starrcade World Cup of Wrestling in 1995. Following Starrcade, he would then win the United States Championship by defeating Diamond Dallas Page in a tournament for the then vacated title. This was followed up by Eddie entering the Cruiserweight division, where he would feud with the likes of Chris Jericho, Rey Mysterio, and of course Dean Malenko. Then, afterwards, Eddie would form the aforementioned LWO, and subsequently the stable known as the Filthy Animals. And as previously mentioned, he alongside the other Radicals of Chris Benoit Benoit, Perry Saturn, and Dean Malenko, Eddie would leave WCW for the WWF, and there he would quickly find success, as Eddie would win both the European and the Intercontinental Championships within his first year in the company. During this time, he would enter a program with China, and he would begin developing some of the more classic Eddie shtick that we would all come to know and love today. Then, after being away from the WWF for a short amount of time, he would return later in 2002 and began a rivalry with Rob Van Dam over the Intercontinental title. After that came the already discussed team of Los Guerreros with his nephew Chavo, who would win the SmackDown titles at the Survivor Series 2002. However, Chavo would be put on the shelf in 2003 after a bicep injury, leaving Eddie to rejoin singles competition, where he would win the United States Championship yet again, but this time for WWE. Then, upon Chavo's return, the two would recapture the tag titles, making Eddie a double champion. Following this, Chavo would turn on Eddie, breaking the group up, and as a once again solo act, Eddie would get the chance to compete in a 15-man Royal Rumble on SmackDown to determine the #1 contender, a match which Eddie won. This led to him earning his shocking upset victory over none other than Brock Lesnar to become WWE Champion, followed by his famous celebration with Chris Benoit at the end of WrestleMania 20 after he retained over Kurt Angle. And then in 2005, Eddie would be involved in his well-known feud with Rey Mysterio, where in kayfabe it was revealed that Rey's son Dominic was secretly Eddie's son, making Dominic storyline-wise a Guerrero, but only in storyline. Well, there you go, the history of the Guerrero family. But what are some of your favorite Guerrero moments? Let me know down in the comments, and please make sure that you're subscribed to this channel and that your notifications are on, and if you could, please give this video a like. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, Dave knows.